Hi there, glad you could join us. We're coming to an interesting story, one that's quite familiar to a lot of folks within a church, but it's to do with Jesus washing the disciples' feet. We'll go to that in a moment, but have you ever been asked to do something and you're not quite ready to do it? Or you've got something else to do, but this looks like you need to do it before that. It can cause all kind of conflicted feelings. You get priorities at work, you've got family demands at home, your other half wants to do something that you hadn't planned. There's so many kind of different things that can just tip the balance, and if you're tired, it can affect you, or you can react in an adverse way. And I suppose this is what's quite interesting about this story. It's more than just about serving. You see, we may be familiar about how Jesus demonstrates the way he is humble in his service when he washes the disciples' feet. And that is an essential part of our Christian living and walking and following Jesus in our lives. But it can be inspiring to read this story because there's so much in here that challenges us to fall into places where maybe we're not so comfortable or we have conflicted feelings. We see the impact it can bring. We can appreciate the quality of such a life, while we know we live in a world that can be at times forgetful of this kind of service. But even those who serve can forget the impact of what service can have on ourselves. So I bring a kind of spiritual health warning to this story. It's kind of sewn into the fabric of what's being told today by John. And it's the cost of being humble. It's the cost of service itself. We do talk about sacrifice, and we know of the challenges and great stories of people sacrificing life. And yet, isn't it strange that in the small things, it's sometimes more awkward and reluctant to give up on those if we get caught off guard. I remember way back in the day when I actually went to selection school to see if I would become a minister of the Church of Scotland, and there were many exercises and interviews, and it had been a good experience. But one of the interviews was with the director of the selection school. And during the interview, he asked me, well, I'd like to go into the ministry. And part of my answer was, I just love working and being around people at certain points and doing certain things. His response surprised me. He just said very quietly, people after a while can sting. He just let it lie there. And so I just let him fill that space, and it came out, just the challenges that time after time after time another person can come along and can be needing our support. Maybe when we're not even ready to give support, and that can sting. I kind of got a taste of that when I was a healthcare chaplain in the Children's Hospital. There for 12 years, and one incident after the other would be a kind of incident of crisis. And you would be dealing with situations. It involved children, and that's very emotive. And I wasn't alone in that. Just because you're a healthcare chaplain is not the only person that has to face these demands. Nurses, doctors and many others are facing it similar. And one of the ways one nurse responded to this when asked the question, how do we keep going? She said simply, well, I've got to care enough for the person in front of me that I'm still ready to care for the next person after them. I wonder what that looks and feels like, maybe if we applied that into our situation. You see, in our story, there are certain elements we should consider. See, Jesus was observant. He knew what needed to be done. In one sense, he had a kind of standard that he set for himself of what was the right thing to do. And he knew there was plenty of opportunity in this situation where they were relaxing, having a meal, to serve. And that act of service was to wash the feet of their fellow followers. You see, they would be reclining at a table, not like what we do and sitting around a table, if we still do that, with their feet tucked under the table. These people would be reclining towards a table with their feet up beside them. So imagine after a day's walking and whatever was going else they were doing, not very good, was it? That type of thing. So maybe there was something amiss here. Maybe someone should have got their feet cleaned, made them feel welcome and be guests. Something was amiss, and Jesus did not get someone else to resolve the problem. He quietly got up, changed, people would see what he was doing, and then he started to wash his disciples' feet. Mindful, he's the master in this particular group. He's the leader in this particular group. But he leads by example. You see, this was at the end of the day. There's nothing tougher to pull out all the stops at the end of the day and rise to challenge of serving. When you're feeling tired, a bit jaded, a bit run down, and you go the extra mile. You dig deep and realise that there's something to be done. One more thing that requires our attention. This was when we could be at our lowest. And that's maybe when we need to be at our best. That is a real test to respond in that challenge of service and to remain humble with it. There's no room for being sanctimonious here. There's no room for pride. There's no room for saying, I'm doing the right thing here. It's an act of humbleness and service in its own right. See, service is sometimes not as inspirational as it looks or even feels. Have there been points at the end of our day when we've been flagging at the end of a shift, or that final half hour, or someone at the end of the queue is still waiting, or our reserves are low, but we still need to draw deep from those reserves to be in a giving place? Well, Jesus did. And to serve is to be in a spiritual battle as well. This story also is quite revealing, because service is almost like a spiritual battlefield where people's hearts and minds are won or lost. See, in our story of the washing of the disciples' feet, there are two people in this story featured: Judas and Peter. Judas was increasingly unsettled and unnerved at the direction of this leader he was following. He'd already seen that Jesus had opted to hop onto a donkey instead of a big horse steed to enter into Jerusalem. This was not the king he was hoping for. This was not the scenario in Jerusalem of a revolution that he had imagined. This was going in a different direction. And who's this mighty king getting down to wash other people's feet? We see he was being played. And John alludes to that more sinister place it took Judas. And Jesus' service brought that out. It's interesting, isn't it, that sometimes our acts of humbleness sometimes are not well received because it jars with how others value their way of living and maybe are guilty or feel guilty of maybe what they should have done, but they still don't want to do it. And then you've got Peter. Well, he's impetuous, isn't he? First of all, he said, "Nah, don't do this, Jesus. This is not what your place." But and then he said, "Well, if I can't wash your feet, well, you can't be part of what we're all about." And then he said, "Well, I'll do everything then." Typical Peter. But you see, he opened up. He accepted. He was on a journey and learned everything at this point. But he was on a journey, and it was at least in the right direction. You see, independency and self-sufficiency, which Peter was tempted to dip into, is the enemy of community. And Jesus says as much. But unlike Judas, Peter starts to learn. And maybe that's what we need to do. We need to realise that we can't be self-sufficient. We can't be independent. If there's an act of kindness shown to us, maybe there should be a sense of gratitude to receive it. He has a journey ahead of him. And maybe we have too, to learn how there's no shame in receiving an act of kindness. Because then it's our opportunity at another time to demonstrate what we've learned. So asking for help is not a bad thing. It might feel like a humbling thing actually. And it can feel awkward. But maybe we need to receive it, to learn how to serve it, and to do it in a way that helps us be sensitive when we serve. So that we're gracious in our serving, even when we're tired, even when we're reaching down to the deepest parts of our reserve, when we're needing a rest, and yet we've still to give of our best. There's an opportunity here to demonstrate what humbleness and service looks like when Jesus has shown us the way. You know, it's happened to me in my life. There's been times when there's been particular people who have pulled out the stops. Some people have just walked beside me and they've talked and chatted. There's other people who have just listened and come and sat with me. There's other times when people have just picked me up when I was feeling down. Made all the difference, the way they did it. And this passage and this story maybe takes us in that direction. Let's be a Peter and start to learn how to receive kindness, but also learn to be like Jesus and learning to show and serve in kindness. TLC, remember? Think of something where we could have an opportunity to serve humbly. Listen. Listen to someone who is sharing and needs your time. And by listening, you are serving. C for caring. Maybe we need to care for someone. We need to take that step, have the eyes to see, to take that step of care and show another person the love that Jesus has shown in our lives. You take care. Thanks for listening and stay safe.